Um, so thanks so much to the Center for Environmental Law and Governance for the invitation to take part today. I'm really sorry that I'm not physically able to be there. I've been rather under the weather, which is a phrase that has taken on new meaning since I moved to Scotland, I have to say. But I'm very glad that I can take part remotely. And please let me know if you're having difficulty hearing, and I'll try to adjust to that. So as I said, I wanted to start out just really very broadly saying a few words about the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is a very large international environmental treaty. It's up to 196 countries as parties, which is most everyone except the United States of America, which is where I'm from, and I believe the Holy See, so the Vatican. And it has three objectives. So the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of biodiversity, and then fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. And I'll be talking about that a bit more later. The CBD is a very broad treaty. A lot can fall under it. And it has these conferences of the parties that happen every 2 years. And that most of what comes out of that are these decisions that can be thought of for the most part as soft law. So there's very few specific binding obligations on parties that come out of these, but they're incredibly useful in terms of guidance, and they're incredibly important in terms of sort of political commitment. And in a very broad way, they do have legal weight. It also has two protocols that do have then very specific legal obligations, and that's the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, which more or less is about the movement of GMOs across from one country to another, and then the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. So I've been researching the CBD and engaged with it since 2010. As Francisco was saying, I'm a lawyer and also a social scientist. So my work here at the University of Edinburgh with engineering life is really around the governance of synthetic biology and around how decision making is happening. And so I treat negotiating events like this COP, like negotiating events of the Biological Weapons Convention. Those are actually my data. So I go and do what's called event ethnographies, where I'm really focused on the process of what's happening there, how decision makers are coming to understand the topics that they're dealing with, what kinds of knowledge they're drawing on, how they make sense of uncertainties, et cetera. So today I'm going to talk about synthetic biology and the CBD, and you might have two questions. You might be wondering, what is synthetic biology? And then even if, or maybe especially if you already know about synthetic biology, maybe you're an expert in it, you might be wondering, what is the CBD trying to do with synthetic biology? So neither of those questions have straightforward answers. So today I'm going to talk a bit about how CBD bodies have been grappling with what is synthetic biology since 2010, when it was introduced, what was discussed sort of under the umbrella of synthetic biology at this COP, and what could come from the decisions that were made. And at the end, I'll come back to that question of why the CBD seems to care about synthetic biology, sort of offer some thoughts about why that might be. So first of all, what is synthetic biology? I can sort of only see the middle section of the room, but do any of you guys, are you familiar with synthetic biology? No, but nobody is jumping up, claiming expertise. Okay, well, the answer to, or what is synthetic biology has really been an open question since it sort of burst onto the scene in the early 2000s. And you had these practitioners claiming that they were developing a new scientific field that was different from previous genetic engineering, that was different from industrial biotechnology, enough that it deserved its own label. And as with many emerging scientific fields, it's taken a long time, and there still hasn't been a clear definition that there's agreement on. To many synthetic biologists, synthetic biology is about taking serious the engineering aspect of genetic engineering. So saying, okay, yeah, in the past, the first waves of genetic engineering, that was just sort of ad hoc, take a gene from one species and sort of slam it into the genome of another species and hope for the best. But now this is going to be about the rational design of sequences of DNA with predictable, discrete functions that can be combined in modular fashion, right? So really trying to apply engineering principles to biology. But sort of the term synthetic biology, a lot of research is happening underneath that, and it doesn't all necessarily automatically fall under that. So, for example, there's synthetic metabolic pathway engineering. So, redesigning metabolic pathways to synthesize specific molecules out of cells, really treating cells as factories. There's also synthetic genomics. So, that's instead of focusing on these very small parts of DNA, you're focused on the larger genome, and you're either trying to start with a full genome and pare it down to its simplest possible version so that you can have this simplified, they like to call it a chassis, that you can then add modular parts to, or building a functional genome from scratch. So you might have heard in 2010, the J. Craig Venter group announced that they had produced the first self-replicating synthetic bacterial cell. So that was they were able to synthesize from scratch, right? A genome that was based on an existing species and then transplanted into a cell from another species that had been stripped of its genome. And there's other kinds of research that happen within synthetic biology as well. Part of the story of synthetic biology is that is around its promises. It's promised to be sort of revolutionize biology, revolutionize biotechnology. One of the sort of focuses of those promises initially was around fuels, so especially biofuels, that they're going to be able to engineer algae to make a cost-effective biodiesel, or make new enzymes for making cellulosic ethanol. And there was initially a lot of funding and industrial attention in biofuels, but over the past 5 years, maybe, we've seen a shift to fuel, which, when you think about it, is very high volume, low value, to flavor and fragrance and chemical compounds, which are low volume but very high value. So we're talking about engineering yeast and engineering E. coli to produce vanillin, to produce the saffron chemical, stevia. So it's been sort of very recently much more focused on sort of industrial biotechnology, but there's still the potential in synthetic biology to produce breakthroughs in biofuels, and to do more, to make microorganisms that will successfully clean up oil spills, do environmental remediation, et cetera, et cetera. There's sort of a lot of the promises from the early 90s, what people thought GMOs would be able to be. There's sort of reigniting those hopes. But then, if that did happen, those would arguably be different kinds of environmental releases of different kinds of GMOs. But see, there you go. I've started out describing research in synthetic biology, and I've sort of shifted to talking about the promises and the perils of what could be. and that's okay for many different kinds of conversations. I think there's a lot of conversations that are important about what synthetic biology should be and what synthetic biology could be, but it's tricky when you're trying to define what synthetic biology is right now. Um, and something else about definitions, investors may love to hear that your radically new approach to biology is going to revolutionize how we feed and fuel and heal ourselves and do conservation. But if you then go to regulators and you say, I have a radically new approach to biology, they might say, oh, then maybe that radically different approach might need a different kind of oversight. And so synthetic biologists have been doing a lot of um, sort of framing it in one way to investors, to the public, framing it in other ways to regulatory bodies. And we've seen different regulatory bodies really grapple with the question of, well, how should we define synthetic biology? Is it really that different from genetic engineering, from existing biotechnology? Is it so novel that it falls outside of the current regulations that exist? Um, so enter the CBD. In 2010, when the J. Craig Venter Institute made their announcement about that self-replicating bacteria, the CBD's subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice was meeting at the time. And some of the delegations were like, okay, this is big stuff. This is big news. This is something that a treaty on biodiversity should be speaking to. And so they added it in two places. They added it to the existing biofuels negotiations, and they also nominated it to be added to the agenda of the CBD as its own standing sort of program of work as what's called in the CBD a new and emerging issue. And so for the past, well, now it's 2017. So we've got almost 7 years that synthetic biology has been sort of hanging there as a potential new and emerging issue. And it's still, the COP has not yet determined whether synthetic biology actually meets the criteria of new and emerging issue, which includes new evidence of unexpected and significant impacts on biodiversity, that it's urgent, et cetera. So it's not officially on the agenda of the CBD. And yet we have now 7 years of engagement by the CBD and its bodies with this issue. And incidentally, it is one of the only international treaties, really international bodies, that's seriously been looking at synthetic biology. The Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention have touched on it as well, but this has certainly been the most substantive. And so we have a series of CBD COP decisions that, for the most part, sort of note the potential for benefits as well as adverse effects on biodiversity, and that call for a precautionary approach and thorough risk assessments. We have a technical series report that was produced by the CBD Secretariat that does an overview of sort of ways that synthetic biology could relate to the objectives of the CBD, and includes an analysis of sort of potential gaps and overlaps in international law. There was an online forum to gather information and perspectives, and there was an ad hoc technical expert group that was formed, which is called, in short, because the CBD is all about acronyms because it's part of the UN. In short, it is referred to as an ATEG. And this has brought together experts from all the regions of the world to examine synthetic biology and biodiversity. So very shortly, sort of going into the COP in Cancun, there was this draft decision that had been agreed upon at the subsidiary body. And a lot of different points were already agreed going in. And that included things like that sort of what synthetic biology is right now, the living organisms that it's producing right now, those fall under the Cartagena Protocol. And the Cartagena Protocol is a good basis for risk assessment of synthetic biology for now. But that as synthetic biology develops, if it starts to sort of deliver on some of these promises of radical newness, that this might change. Um, that everybody should be conducting research on the potential impacts on biodiversity of synthetic biology. And this is sort of a big issue, is that one of the reasons they haven't been able to decide whether it's a new and emerging issue is because there's not really that much data. There's not really any data on the potential interactions of the components and organisms and products of synthetic biology, and how that relates to biodiversity in the environment. Um, and uh, it established that the CBD is going to continue to work on this. So thank you. There will be an online forum. The Secretariat's going to continue to collect information. There's the ad hoc technical expert group is going to continue, et cetera. But there were sort of three main areas where there wasn't agreement going in. And so that's what I'll talk about for the next 10 minutes. So that was an operational definition for synthetic biology, whether the Nagoya Protocol should clarify how, if and how the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources relates to access and benefit sharing. I'll explain that. And then not in the agreed upon or bracketed text, but what was anticipated to be introduced was the issue of gene drives, which I'll also talk about a bit more. So first of all, this operational definition. Now, as mentioned before, definitions in a legal and regulatory context sort of have a huge impact. At stake here was an operational definition that the ATEG had developed. So it wasn't meant to be anything binding or permanent. It was meant to be something that could be used, right? And so I'll just read that out. It is. Synthetic biology is a further development and new dimension of modern biotechnology that combines science, technology, and engineering to facilitate and accelerate the understanding, design, redesign, manufacture, and/or modification of genetic materials, living organisms, and biological systems. Now, is that broad? Yes, it is very broad. It basically provides a general umbrella for talking about new trends in the life sciences and biotechnology. And so there was a question, some state parties said this definition is not useful unless it includes inclusion and exclusion criteria. So points where we can check boxes to say, is this definitely synthetic biology, or is this definitely not synthetic biology? And ultimately, the COP agreed to leave it as it is, to not demand additional criteria. And the language that they used, which was many hours of debate over, was that it acknowledges this operational definition and considers it useful as a starting point for the purpose of facilitating scientific and technical deliberations under the convention and its protocols. So it's very specific to the CBD, and it's very specifically saying this can facilitate general discussion. There's not, in other words, it doesn't sort of, it's not sort of setting it up as a regulatory mechanism in any way. So gene drives, secondly, these weren't in the text being negotiated, but coming into Cancun, there were parties, and especially civil society groups, arguing that this was an issue that's so new and it's moving so rapidly that it needs attention and it needs it now. And so what gene drives are basically is recent advances in gene editing tools, especially around CRISPR Cas9, if you might have heard of that, is making this research possible, which can cause a specific trait to be inherited by all offspring. So you can introduce a genetically engineered trait and then have it drive it through an entire wild offspring, because it will always be passed on. So, for example, at a side event, there was this nonprofit group, Island Conservation, that presented the case for releasing gene edited mice on islands overrun with invasive rodents. So, the engineered mice would breed with the invasives and would only reproduce male offspring. And so, if over time all of your mice are always only producing male offspring, and then those are breeding with others, and all of their offspring are male, eventually you can terminate a population. At other side events, civil society groups were calling for a global moratorium on the applied research and release of gene drives because they were arguing that organisms with gene drives aren't like other GMOs, right? Because they're made to spread. They're specifically made to persist in the environment and not be contained. And so they argued that any field release is essentially a global release. Okay, thank you.
You can take more time, don't worry.
Okay, take a little more time. So going into the negotiations, there was there was expectation that this was going to be a really hot topic, and it was like side events were overflowing. They were full of passion, and in the formal debates, like Mauritania tabled language on a moratorium, but in the formal negotiations on synthetic biology, they barely touched on the substantive aspects of gene drives, right? It really just focused on the process, on whether it was okay that they were being introduced this late in the negotiating cycle. And so at the end of the day, there wasn't really discussion on gene drives, and there's a very non-committal reference to them in the final decision that extends the precautionary approach in a very low-key, roundabout way. So instead of gene drives, sort of the unexpected breakout controversy was this question of access and benefit sharing for digital sequences of genetic information. And this basically came down to between biodiversity rich countries and biotechnology rich countries. So we have this long history of pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries going to tropical and subtropical regions and using the genetic resources there, the plants, fungi, animals, microbial communities, as a source of new drug and product discovery, and often with the assistance of communities that hold traditional knowledge and local knowledge about those places. And so one of the points of the CBD was that it established that those genetic resources weren't just there for the taking, that they were not a common heritage of all mankind, right? But that countries have sovereign rights to their biodiversity, and that providers should share in the benefits of, say, a blockbuster cancer drug that's based on a rainforest flower. So the Nagoya Protocol then is designed to give further legal effect to that idea. Right, so it ensures fair and equitable exchange between providers and commercial users through things like material transfer agreements and prior informed consent. And the Nagoya Protocol is pretty recent, so the UK's implementing legislation is just from 2015. But many countries in the global south are already worried that a major loophole is already developing. Because like the EU and the UK legislation for Nagoya Protocol is specifically focused on the physical transfer of genetic materials. So taking that rainforest flower and bringing it to a lab in the UK. But widespread DNA sequencing combined with the increasing capability and lowered cost of DNA synthesis is changing how genetic resources can travel. So you can upload or email genetic information from the tropics, and you can download that information anywhere. So the FAO refers to this as the dematerialization of biology. And so with the rise of especially open source online genetic databases, many developing countries are concerned that digital sequence information on their genetic resources is sort of paving a new route for the unfair commercial exploitation of their biodiversity. It's not that they don't want their biodiversity to be used, to be exploited, to be in some cases for some communities are fine with commercialization. It's that they want to be sure to share in those benefits. So Going into the Cancun, this was like basically a bracketed like one line in the annex of the decision on synthetic biology. But developing country delegations showed up in Cancun and they were like, "What up? This is it. Like this is the issue of all issues." Um, uh, Yeah, like that they didn't want to wait for this to be studied, that the time for action needed to be now, because the use of digital sequence information is growing extremely rapidly, and spreading technologically, and that action needed to be taken. And the response to that, from, it has to be said, mostly what are referred to as user countries, so countries like the UK, many European countries, Japan, was first of all, again, process issues, right? That, oh, this issue is completely sprung on us, or, oh, it's still premature. We really don't know how this is happening. In any case, like, why are you, like, these are synthetic biology discussions. Why are you, this is much broader issue than synthetic biology. Like, why are you even bringing this up? But also fundamentally, they argued that to regulate digital sequence information was to demand the impossible, right? That it's the internet. You can't stop it. And the response from key developing country delegations was, look, using digital sequence information without proper consent, without benefit sharing arrangements, is biopiracy. And this needs to be acknowledged by the global community first and foremost. And then once that acknowledgement is made, then we can tackle the complexities of governance. So ultimately, there was some action that was taken on it. So a new ATEG was established and a study was commissioned, which is going to lay the groundwork for decisions at the next negotiating sessions. And also, they're going to be exploring a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, which is one possible approach to handling digital genetic sequence information. So I'm just going to end like 2 or 3 minutes with a few thoughts on what the CBD we could think of as what it is they're trying to do with synthetic biology. And I think if you look at that really broad definition, one way to think about this is that the CBD isn't trying to do anything about synthetic biology, or at least not synthetic biology in particular. It's not trying to define it in a way that will set it up as being specifically different and novel, and therefore needing different novel governance. Rather, the CBD is using synthetic biology as an opportunity to address aspects of biotechnology, of the life sciences, that a goodly part of the global community feels requires attention and analysis and debate. And so we can see this with digital sequence information, right? Okay, it's not about whether it's uniquely synthetic biology. Everybody recognizes, like, yeah, this isn't about synthetic biology necessarily. We're just using synthetic biology to get our foot in the door to start discussion. And also, it's not necessarily even about being something novel, because the digitalization of genetic resources, it's not a new trend, it's just a growing trend. It's been sort of on the radar for a long time. And similarly, gene drives, right? They're not uniquely a product or a project of synthetic biology, but that's not going to stop the treaty from examining it more closely in the future. Like this, even though a gene drive moratorium, sort of the journal Nature reported it as having been shot down and as sort of a failure of critics to stop research in that, I think that's too simplistic because, first of all, there really wasn't substantive formal debate. It was rejected on procedural ground. And if you talked to lots of delegates informally said, gene drives is a quintessential issue for the CBD because they can't be contained in national boundaries, because they raise these questions of the ethics of conservation, of understandings of containment. But also it's too simplistic because the call for a moratorium was not a call to stop gene drives. It was a call to pause gene drive, especially sort of putting it out there in the wild and doing field tests before global guidance could be developed. And so while some see synthetic biology as sort of a fundamentally new approach to biology, others as the next stage of biotechnology, others as simply an exercise in rebranding of biotechnology. I think for the CBD, synthetic biology is an opportunity to sort of re-examine biotechnology and not just how it can be governed, but how it can be shaped and its trajectory influenced.
Thank you very, very much. Usually I'm a much stricter chair and I would have stopped you, but I found that tremendously interesting. So thank you very, very much, Deborah, for that. As I said, I would like to open the floor just for any immediate questions that there may be. If you do want to ask a question, please just very briefly say your name and your affiliation or the program that you're following here at Strathclyde. I will then give the floor to Dr. Daniela Diez, because obviously the presentations are in a way linked to each other, and we'll have much more time at the end for a wider Q&A session. But is there anybody who wants to react immediately to Deborah's presentation? Okay. Miranda, can you bring the mic up to Lord, please? Or you can come down.
Thank you. My name is Lord. I'm studying LLM program at the School of Law here. I realize I have followed the generic development and research over the years, and I have realized that recently, I think there has been a change of mind or approach to it. I don't know, but I have a feeling that in the past there were a lot of, the human involvement was, everyone was scared and careful not to, I'm talking about touching on the area of morality and, trust. I think that has changed a lot now. And I'm wondering if it is because scientists like yourself are pushing with a lot of evidence or evidential proof to show that it is not that risky, or is it because that we have realized that we need that branch of science in order to help us survive as human beings? Thank you.
Do you want to react, Deborah?
Sure. Maybe just, are there any other brief questions?
Is there any other questions so she can... Miranda, yourself, yes?
Yeah, I was just, sorry, my name is Miranda Gilt. I'm a PhD candidate, but I've worked quite a bit on GMOs. I was wondering a little bit about the gene drive, because to be quite fair, it's the first time I've heard it. And I was wondering, is that topic, is it a approach, is there, just because the end result, so the product is particularly different from what we've been talking about so far, or is it also because the technology behind it is different from what we're talking about so far?
Just one more question and then we'll give you the floor, Deborah.
Okay.
I'm Nana. I'm on the LLM, International Law and Sustainable Development. I was looking up in taking a field dissertation in GMOs with the African perspective. We realized that even though there are bio safety mechanisms which have been put in place by the Cartagena Protocol and all that, but when you go to the field, you realize that it's not being complied with. For my case in Ghana and other African countries, there are field trials which are going on. And you could realize that the consumers, the farmers themselves don't know what is going on. So what are the mechanisms which will be put in place so that those who are not really educated about this whole revolution wouldn't be stripped of their rights as indigenous people, local people? Thank you.
Okay, we'll get more
Okay.
questions afterwards when we have the wider Q&A. But Deborah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to be really brief because I realize I went over my time with the discussion, and those are three like getting at some big questions and big issues. So maybe to start with, first of all, just to address gene drives. So I think that, yeah, I mean, if y'all are interested in GMOs and GMO regulation, I recommend checking out Gene Drives because it's poised to shake things up. And that is in part because it's a different kind of organism in terms of how it is meant to interact with the broader environment, in the sense that it is meant to persist, it is meant to spread. But also, I mean, it is one of the an area where these new gene editing techniques, specifically CRISPR-Cas9, where it's something that we've known is possible for a long time. There's been a long history of research about what's called selfish genes, so genes that would always get passed on instead of having sort of a more Mendelian, like, oh, you get passed on to some but not others, of offspring. So it's been known about, but now it's able to be done because of CRISPR-Cas9, and so that's raising these questions about what we know about that new approach, questions about what needs to be known, what kind of information do we know that, like, what do we need to know? What do we need to know that we don't know? What kinds of uncertainties are going to be allowable for this to go forward? And so that is, those questions that are being raised, I think they get to both the first and the last question as well. I mean, I think that what's actually happening at the CBD is, within the synthetic biology conversations, is a reopening of some discussion on how we think about GMOs and how we understand how the benefits and risks can be measured and balanced, sort of a reopening of that. So I don't think that it's necessarily that the global consensus going forward is that, oh, it turns out this stuff isn't risky. I wouldn't say that that's at all the case. I mean, but it should definitely be noted that in the sphere of the CBD, there are very strong voices saying we need this science in order for conservation. We need this science for food security. But there is also very strong voices saying we need to know more about this science, or we need to have these kinds of safeguards, or we need to discuss what kinds of safeguards we should have. And the story of what the Cartagena Protocol means when it gets discussed at the CBD in Cancun versus what does it mean in a field in Ghana. This is the story of international law. Unfortunately, this is the struggle of how do we make things relevant, how do we make things meaningful at all the different levels and all the different stages. But I do know a bit about sort of how the African food sovereignty community has been engaging and thinking about this. So I'd be very happy to get your information and we can sort of have a conversation about that. I can give you some resources outside of this space.